Jameson Mitchell here, and in this video I'm continuing my series on Howard's Grand Tableau, this time focusing on what I call the essence line, so stay tuned. And here we are with the cards that have been in Howard's Grand Tableau, and the deck that I've been using for this series has been the Mystical Lenormand. It is by Regula Elizabeth Fiechter, and the artwork is by Trösch. And so before I get into the essence line, I'm going to take a moment to kind of just recap what we've done so far in this series. So in the first part, I introduced the tableau and introduced my friend Howard, and I always do this. I go into the reading without explaining who Howard is and why this came about. So Howard is a friend of mine, and when I was just starting in on my Lenormand journey, especially reading for other people, Howard was kind enough to kind of be a guinea pig for me. He was going through a time where he was working on his Akashic Records Consultant training and certification, and he was in the process of trying to build that business up and having conversations with people about his service offerings, and was finding that period a bit of a challenge. And so it was an opportunity for me to do a Lenormand card reading, for him to hopefully get some information, some insight, some clarity, some direction on how to move forward with that endeavor. So in the first part, like I was alluding to before, I looked at the overall layout and kind of made my initial impressions of the tableau. And then in the second part, I looked at the first three cards in the tableau, because that for me offers general advice about the story that's going to be unfolding. And then I looked at the four corners, and the four corners for me when I read a tableau tell us what the story is in like a brief kind of a snapshot summation kind of energy. So did that, and then we moved from that to looking at the cards that surrounded the significator. And so the gentleman is here, and so in that video I looked at the cards that were behind him, above him, below him, and ahead of him. So did that, and then in the following video I did a technique that I called the diagonals. So we looked at the cards that were coming in on a diagonal to the significator, and that was at the top and below, underneath, on the one side going to the significator. And then we looked at the diagonals that were leading from the significator, going from the top and the bottom. So that was that. And then in the previous video, which was the last video I did in the series, was knighting. And so knighting is just a process where it's like playing chess, and you move, you find the significator and you move two positions up and one over. That would be either way, or one position up and two over, either way. And then you would do the same thing reverse. You would move two positions down and one over either way, or one position down and two over either way. And the knighting is a process that kind of just gives you more insight about the nature of the significator, which would be the gentleman in this case, or if you were going to do with a topic card, then it would give you more information about that particular topic. And so now all of that has brought us to this point, and once you do all those techniques, and again I always say that you don't have to do all of them, I would encourage you, if you're going to do this, get a feel for it, do them all, and then see which ones resonate with you. Some are more optional, like the diagonals, and the knighting is optional. You don't have to do it. And then just see what you get a feel for, and see what you like and what you don't like, and just move forward from there. So now, having done all of those, it brings us to what I call the essence line. And in this particular tableau, there are two types of tableaus, I should say. So my favorite is what's called the 8x4 plus 4, and that's 4 rows of 8 cards, which are the 32 cards here that make up the tableau, and then the plus 4 are the 4 cards down here at the bottom. So I've alluded to in previous videos that I talked about the tableau is that the 4 cards in the bottom for me represent what I call the essence line. It's also known as the fate line or the destiny line. And the purpose of this line is that you look at the cards to kind of offer a final piece of advice to the person who the reading is for. So in this particular case, when I did this, this was Howard's essence line, and so this was the final advice or the final piece of the puzzle, if you will, for his situation. And so now I'm going to focus more on those lines, so I'm going to readjust the camera so we have a close-up of those particular cards, because this is going to be the remainder of the video is focusing on those 4 cards. Alright, so I've adjusted the camera so I can get a close-up of the 4 cards that are making up the essence line. And so here we have garden, we have the cross, we have letter, and we have coffin. So these are the 4 cards, and I'm going to touch on what the cards are, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about the houses that each card is in, because I know that there were some people who are watching the series who were very interested in looking at how I go about interpreting the card in the house. So I will do that with this essence line, because especially with the first card, it's very significant, or at least I thought it was when I did the reading. So going with that, we have garden in the house of the key. So this is how I look at the house of the key. The key in Lenormand for me represents the truth of the situation. So, you know, when I'm doing a grand tableau, I always look to see what card falls into the house of the key, because that one particular placement will suggest what the overall truth of the picture is. And you could also look for the key card itself and to see what house it's in. But here was very interesting. When I saw that garden was in the house of the key, I looked at it in 2 ways. Garden is a card for me. Some of the keywords I have for it are audience, especially when you're looking at things from a business perspective, like your audience. Who's your audience? Who are the people that you are providing your business products or services to? It's a card that can represent community, groups. And in this particular case, in the context of the question, when I did my overall or initial impressions of the layout, I noticed that for me, garden can represent things like guides and angels. And so in this particular case, for Howard being a Akashic Records Consultant, I looked at this as the record keepers themselves, or, you know, the guides in that particular case. So I'm going to approach that from 2 different perspectives, one being the record keepers and then one being the audience. And so going with the idea that garden is in the house of the key, it's stressing the importance of audience. So that has been actually the crux of Howard's problem, is because he was feeling like he couldn't get enough people interested in his Akashic Records Consulting. So that it just reinforced that whole concern that he had. So I looked at this and I thought that the audience of people would be a certain type of people. Here's the thing about spiritual businesses especially, and I would consider the Akashic Records Consulting to be a spiritual business, is that you have to understand that the business is not going to be for everybody. So there is a certain type of audience that Howard may need to really become more clear on or discover, keeping with the idea that key represents discovery. So it could be that the people that he is talking to may not be the actual people who would really benefit from his Akashic Records Consulting. So I thought about that further, and then if we look at the garden card as community, then here's the thing, and I think that happens with a lot of spiritual people who are running a lot of spiritual businesses and practices, is that we sometimes get in a community of people who do the same thing we do, and we have conversations about what we do with those people, and we forget or don't make the distinction that they may not be our audience. You know, I'm going to go with myself as an example. As a card reader, I spend lots of time online in lots of different card reading communities, and I have to understand at some point those are my peers, that's my tribe, that's my social community, that kind of energy. They may not be my clients or my customers ever because they do the same thing that I do. So it's about like stepping out of your modality and the people that you consider peers and that you're hanging out with, because I pointed this out to Howard. I'm like, if you're spending a lot of your time talking to other Akashic Records consultants, or you're in forums or groups where there's people doing the same thing that you're doing, they're not going to be your customer more often than not. So I mean, there may be instances where you trade a reading, or you exchange a reading, or you barter something like that, because I know I've done that. But generally speaking, it's like that's not going to be the way for you to create business when you're hanging out with the people who are doing the exact same thing that you're doing. So I pointed that out to him, and so I said, in that regard, it's about you discovering the people who need to experience an Akashic Records consultant, a consulting session. And so even with that, it's about understanding who are those people. With the garden being a social thing, it's like, where do those people hang out? Where would you find those people? And that's just a number one rule of business when it comes to audience building anyway. It's about determining who your people are and where do they hang out. So that would be another thing. He would have to maybe change his focus from maybe building community with people who are doing the same thing, and then finding the people who would best benefit from his services. It would also be like, who would be the type of person who would actually seek out an Akashic Records consulting service? I mean, who would those types of people be? What would they be looking for? What answers or solutions, going with the idea that key represents answers or solutions, what answers or solutions would those types of people be seeking that they would choose that avenue to find those answers? So the biggest thing here I'm seeing is that the discovery of the audience is the key issue here, and it just mirrors what the issue was that Howard brought to the table. So I'm seeing that with Garden in the House of the Key. So we can move on to the next card, which is Cross. And so Cross for me can represent burdens, difficulties, and responsibilities. I also see it as a card that represents spirituality and religion. So, but I'm going to go with the idea here that it's about burden and difficulties and responsibilities. Now, Cross is in the house of fish, and so I look at this as fish being two things. It can be an entrepreneur, and it could be money. So for me, going with the fish being like the house of the entrepreneur here, it would say that it's talking about the difficulty and the burden of being an entrepreneur or entrepreneurship, which is again mirroring the issue that Howard was bringing to the table at the time the reading was done. So it mirrors that for me. Now, in terms of money, it could also be, and we really didn't touch on this when I had this session with Howard, this card can also, or this placement could be about financial difficulties, financial responsibilities, the burden of finances. And so it could be that he could be putting the burden on the business, especially when it's just starting up, for it to be making money. And so that may be something that he would have to look at. But we really didn't discuss it in the moment. This is what we did discuss, and this is a very spiritual idea, again, with the idea that cross can represent spiritual things, that I considered the idea for him to, kind of just explore, that there may be some karmic issue, because besides spirituality and religion, the cross can be a card of karma. So maybe there's a karmic issue for him around money, and that could be part of the challenge here with that. So it's almost like a karmic debt. And so sometimes, even with the business, it could be saying too, like maybe he's being charged with doing this work because it's like a karmic debt that he has to pay. If you go with the idea of karma and past lives and those kinds of things, it could be like there may be energy from a past life, you know, where he incurred this kind of debt, and he's in this lifetime needing to pay that debt off, and this may be the avenue in which that gets played out. But if you don't subscribe to that, then we could just leave it at the idea of, you know, the burden, difficulty, and responsibility of being an entrepreneur and with entrepreneurship. So I saw that. Now, the next card going over is letter, and letter represents news or messages. I also see letter as paperwork and documents and documentation, because letter is communication that is in written form. So it's written correspondence. So I'm seeing that. So there is a news or message aspect here, of course, and that's really what the process is. Being an Akashic Records consultant is that you are actually delivering messages to the client from the Akashic Records and the record keepers. So I saw that with letter, but it's in the house of the anchor. And so the anchor for me represents work. And so the message here could be that Howard has to understand this is work. He may have had the idea that it was going to be easier than he thought going in, but anchor represents not just work, but hard work. And so it could be, you know, the message here for him is that the underlying energy of this is that it's going to be work, and it's going to be hard work. Now, another way of looking at the possible message could be that Howard is being advised from his spiritual team, his spiritual community, his spirit guides, that he's to stick with this, because anchor is about persistence and perseverance and sticking with something. So I'm seeing that as the energy here. And so it could also be the work, you know, going with the idea of the house of anchor being work. The work here is about actually delivering the messages. And I'm going with the image here, and it has the dove with the letter in its beak delivering it, you know, almost like a carrier pigeon, almost like, you know, delivering the message. And so it could be that, you know, his work is actually delivering the message. Now, one of the things that may be helpful, since I talked about letter being written forms of communication, one way that, and I don't know, because this is just coming to me in the moment, we didn't discuss this, one way to get the message out, so to speak, would be to actually write. So it would be like maybe writing about the Akashic Records, writing about the types of people who come to seek it, writing about the benefits of getting an Akashic Records consult, you know, those kinds of energies, but it would be like in written form. And so my natural impulse when I look at it that way would be, you know, he could write a blog, you know, a blog, series of blog articles on that, whether it would be on his platform or someone else's. It would, so that would be good. It would be important for him to have a website in order for him to have his own blog, or he could just start a blog now. You know, he could just get the blog going and find ways to direct people to it. The other thing that he could do, since we have garden here, would be finding ways to deliver the messages, possibly through email, you know, written form of communication. Another one is email. So it could be like sending out an email to a group of people and finding that. He may have a little bit of challenge with that, because I'm looking at the cross in between the two cards, and so that, you know, going with the idea of that could be, you know, a difficult, or, you know, it could be a challenge, a burden to some extent, but it could be like he just has to do that. It's important for him to get the message out, so he has to find ways to get it out. So I'm seeing that as the letter in the house of anchor. And then rounding out the essence line, we have coffin. And coffin for me is a card that represents endings, it represents completion, it can also represent limitation and restriction, but it also can represent transition. So I'm seeing all that with the energy of coffin. Now, coffin is in the house of the cross, and so we've already touched on it here because we have the cross in the line. So again, the house of cross could represent, like, you know, something being difficult, something being burdensome, something of a spiritual or religious nature. And so going with that, I would look at it as the coffin would be something ending, and then the house of the cross, it could be like the ending of a difficulty, ending of something that was a burden. you know, that kind of energy. And so that would be a nice way to round that out. So it's like if he sticks with this, going with the card coming with the letter in the house of the anchor, if he sticks with this, if he sticks with getting the message out, he will at some point see an end to the difficulty, you know. So that's a very positive sign. Now, the other thing here with the coffin can represent like an unconscious state, because I tend to look at it as like things like resting, sleeping, dreaming, and all those are, you know, being in a state of unconsciousness. And so looking at that, it could also be saying too that Howard has to stop the ways that he may be limiting or restricting himself. So it's about, but I'm going to say if he's doing that, if he's limiting or restricting himself, he may do it from, or may be doing it from a place of being unconscious, like he's not aware that he's doing it. So it's about him looking at the ways he's limiting and restricting himself, and how can he move beyond that, because that may be part of the difficulty. It's like he's limiting or restricting himself. And it could be too that he's limiting and restricting his audience. He's limiting and restricting the way he's delivering the message. You know, there's other ways that he could be limiting and restricting himself besides his actual self. But it could be just showing up like he's saying, well, there's not enough of an audience, or, you know, that would be the first thing you know, and so he's limiting himself by with the belief that there's not enough people who would need what it is that he's trying to offer. So I'm seeing that as coffin in the house of cross. And so the next thing that I do is I take the line and I start create what I call the final summation. So doing that, I always tend to start with the first card and then pair it with the next card. So here we have garden and cross. So that could be read as spiritual community or spiritual group, because I always look to the first card as the subject, and then the second card in the pairing as to how that subject is being described. So here we have a spiritual group or spiritual community. Then with cross and letter, then cross becomes difficulty being the subject, and it would be like difficulty with the message, or the burden of the message, or being responsible, or the responsibility of the message. And then looking at the last two cards here, letter and coffin, it would be a message that brings closure. So that was the first thing that jumped out at me with that. And so having looked at that, and the reason why I do that is I do that as a way to kind of, if I kind of look at all the individual pairings, it may help me come up with an overall sentence for the line. So here's what I came up with there, and I'm going to approach it two ways, because remember I said garden was about the record keepers, which are Howard's guides, as well as his audience. And so these are the two things that I came up with, one for each. So going with the guides first, I look at it as the guides, going with the garden, critical, because I tend to look at cross as something that's critical or necessary. So the guides, critical message with the letter, brings closure with the coffin. So I'll say that again. So the guides, critical message, brings closure. That would be reading the line from the perspective of the record keepers and Howard's guides. Now, if we look at it from the audience perspective, I came up with the audience or community, going with the garden, is critical or necessary, going with the cross, or the message, going with the letter, goes nowhere, with the coffin, comes to an end, again with the coffin, or stops. So I'll say that again. The audience or community is critical or necessary for the message, or else it goes nowhere, it comes to an end, or it stops. So that has been how I read the essence line. And so if you have been following this series, I want to just say that this is what I call the penultimate video, because in our next video, we're going to be wrapping things up. It's going to be the final video in the series. And in that video, I'm going to do a process that I call counting round, which is going to produce, for those of you who've been following my Lenormand videos for some time, is going to produce a line of 5. And I know there are a number of you who like the way I approach a line of 5. So we're going to extract a line of 5, and that's going to kind of just round things out and bring this whole series to a close. So Thank you for sharing space with me in this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. And until then, have a great day and take care.